I'm very pleased that I get the opportunity to discuss here today my concept of non-local consciousness, based on scientific research on near-death experiences in survivors of cardiac arrest. A near-death experience, NDE, or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma, still gives rise to many unbelieving and critical questions, especially by physicians and neuroscientists. But as already William James 1 century ago had said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal. How can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories from a period of obvious unconsciousness? Or how is it possible that permanent life changes occur after cardiac arrest of only 2 minutes? Being a cardiologist, I have been able and privileged to study patients with an NDE during cardiac arrest since 1986. And since then, my scientific curiosity was more and more provoked because according to our current medical concepts, it is not possible to experience consciousness during a cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. In medical school, I had always learned that it was obvious that consciousness was the product of a functioning brain. But now the phenomenon of near-death experience raised a number of fundamental questions. How and why does an NDE occur? And how does the content of an NDE come about? And even more important questions for me were, how is consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? And is it possible to speak of a beginning of our consciousness, and will our consciousness ever end? But first, what is an NDE? Some people who have survived a life-threatening crisis report an extraordinary experience. An NDE can be described as the reported memory of a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of universal elements, such as an out-of-body experience with veridical perceptions, pleasant feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, a life review, or the conscious return into the body. And many circumstances are described during which NDEs are reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, children, or asphyxia, but also in serious diseases not immediately life-threatening, during depression, isolation, meditation, or without any obvious reason. And similar experiences to NDE can occur during the terminal phase of illness and are called end-of-life experiences. And the NDE is always transformational, always causing profound changes in life inside, the loss of the fear of death, and enhanced intuitive sensitivity. So this is why these kind of experiences are also called spiritually transformative experiences, or STE. And near-death experiences occur with increasing frequency because of the improved survival rate resulting from modern techniques of resuscitation. And the content of the NDE and the effects on patients seem similar worldwide, across all times, all cultures. And according to a recent inquiry in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE, which means that more than 9 million people in the USA and about 20 million people in Europe must have had an NDE. So why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about his NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. For most physicians, it's the NDE an incomprehensible and still unknown phenomenon. And once a conference was held about NDE in a university hospital with more than 300 people in attendance. And at the end of the conference, after several lectures about NDE, a man stood up and said, I am a cardiologist for more than 25 years, and I have never heard such absurd stories. This is total nonsense. I don't believe one word of it. And then another man stood up in the audience and said, I am one of your patients. I have had an NDE, and you would be the last one I would ever tell. They feel exactly that these kind of physicians are not able to listen. Now, until recently, there was no prospective and scientifically designed study to explain the cause and content of an NDE. All studies had been retrospective and very selective with respect to patients. And retrospective studies, many years can elapse between the occurrence of the NDE and its investigation, which often prevents accurate assessment of medical circumstances. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological, or demographic explanation why people experience consciousness during a period of clinical death. So in 1988, we started a prospective study of 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause, and content of an NDE. And we studied patients who survived cardiac arrest, which is also called clinical death. And this is a well-described, life-threatening medical situation where patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model of the process of dying. And we also performed a longitudinal study with interviews after 2 and 8 years with a matched control group of patients without NDE to assess if the transformation was caused by the NDE or by the cardiac arrest itself. This had never been studied before in a prospective design. This cartoon was published in a Dutch newspaper when our study was published in The Lancet in December 2001. What we found is that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of the period of unconsciousness. However, 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection of the period of clinical death. And of those patients, 41, 12%, had a core experience with a score of 6 or higher, and 21, 6%, had a superficial NDE. And in the longitudinal study, we found that the loss of the fear of death, the transformation in attitude toward life, and an enhanced intuitive sensitivity only occurred in patients with an NDE. And it was a surprising finding that an experience of only some minutes causes such a lifelong transformation. We also found that despite the mostly positive experience, the NDE was also a traumatic event because there's hardly any acceptance by doctors, nurses, family, friends, and partner, with a divorce rate of more than 70%, which makes the process of acceptance and integration very difficult. And this process will take many, many years with strong feelings of depression, homesickness, and loneliness. But the longer the interval between NDE and the interview, the more positive changes are usually reported. The NDE can indeed be considered as a spiritual crisis. Now, what might distinguish the small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? We found, to our surprise, that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, nor the need for intubation in complicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest and electrophysiological stimulation, EPS, had any influence on the frequency of NDE. The severity or duration of anoxia did not matter at all. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, gender, religion, or education. And in the past, several theories have been proposed to explain the NDE. However, in our prospective study, we could exclude that psychological, pharmacological, or physiological factors cause these experiences during cardiac arrest. With a purely physiological explanation, such as cerebral anoxia, most patients who had been clinical death should report an NDE, but only 18% reported an NDE, although all patients in our study had been unconscious because of anoxia of the brain resulting from the cardiac arrest. Besides, as I told you before, it is a well-established fact that people without any lack of oxygen in the brain, like in depression or meditation, can also experience an enhanced consciousness, a so-called spiritually transformative experience. In 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, a study from the USA, and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 patients. Bruce Grayson writes in his comments that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of an NDE. The paradoxical occurrence of heightened lucid awareness and logical thought process during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation to brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain. And Sempani and Peter Fennick from the British study write that the data from several NDE studies suggest that the NDE arises during unconsciousness. And this is a surprising conclusion because when the brain is so dysfunctional that a patient is deeply comatose, those cerebral structures which underpin subjective experience and memory must be severely impaired. Complex experiences, such as reported in NDE, should not arise or be retained in memory. Such patients would be expected to have no subjective experience. And Penny Sartori concludes that according to mainstream science, it is quite impossible to find a scientific explanation for the NDE as long as we believe that consciousness is only a side effect of a functioning brain. The fact that people report lucid experiences in their consciousness when the brain activity has ceased is, in her view, difficult to reconcile with current medical opinion. Such a brain couldn't even hallucinate. It couldn't do anything at all. So we have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our and other studies during cardiac arrest, NDE was experienced during a transient functional loss of all functions of the cortex and the brainstem, with a flatline EEG. But how do we know that the EEG is flat in those patients with cardiac arrest? Through many studies with induced cardiac arrest, both in human and animal models, cerebral function has been shown to be severely compromised during cardiac arrest, with complete cessation of cerebral flow, causing unconscious sudden loss of consciousness and of all body reflexes, the function of the cortex, but also with the abolition of all brainstem activity, like the loss of the gag reflex, the corneal reflex, and fixed and dilated pupils are clinical findings in those patients. And also the function of the respiratory center, localized close to the brainstem, fails, resulting in apnoea. And the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, but also in the deeper structures of the brain and animal studies, have been shown to be absent after 10 to 20 seconds, a flatline EEG. And in an acute myocardial infarction, the duration of cardiac arrest in the coronary care unit is always longer than 20 seconds, usually at least 60 to 120 seconds. And in a hospital ward or in an out-of-hospital arrest, it even takes much longer. So all 562 survivors of cardiac arrest in the 4 prospective studies must have had a flatline EEG. However, some patients with an NDE could report an enhanced consciousness. And because of the occasional and verifiable out-of-body experiences, we know that the NDE must happen during the period of unconsciousness and not in the first or last second of cardiac arrest. Now, the inevitable conclusion that the NDE occurs during cardiac arrest, when the function of the cortex and brainstem have ceased, is often called impossible and unscientific. The quite often proposed objection that the flatline EEG does not rule out any brain activity because it is mainly a registration of the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex misses the mark. The issue is not whether there is any brain activity of any kind whatsoever, but whether there is brain activity of the specific form regarded by contemporary neuroscience as the necessary condition for conscious experience, with measurable activities in many neural centers, the so-called global neural workspace. And it has been proven that there is no such specific brain activity at all during cardiac arrest.